The Arctic is a uniquely beautiful place. Yes, it's cold, windy, and generally inhospitable to any life that isn't well adapted to the extreme conditions. But it's always had a unique aura to it. This rare sense of calm that you don't get from most other environments. Maybe I'm weird for appreciating that beauty. Maybe my feelings are skewed because I've spent so much time exploring the Arctic. Being a climate scientist who specializes in polar environments, it's largely unavoidable. But my bias aside, I used to feel most at peace spending time in the Arctic, enjoying those cold gusts and crisp air. I say used to because I don't think I'll ever know that peace again. I don't even think I could ever go back again, not after what I've experienced. I'm sending this message from a remote location near the equator. And trust me, when you hear my story, you'll understand why. And you too may feel compelled to get as far away from the poles as possible. During those last fateful trips to the Arctic, I saw things, heard things, felt things in the deepest pits of my soul. But for the sake of this world and everyone in it, I'm going to do my best. I need to get this message out there. People need to know what's coming. You see, there's something underneath the polar ice caps. One under the North Pole and one under Antarctica. They've been there for thousands of years, trapped under miles upon miles of snow and ice. But now, because of climate change and melting ice caps, they're about to awaken. And when they do, we may not be able to survive this time. It may seem like the ravings of a madman. Perhaps my mind is not entirely healthy, but I know I'm not crazy. What I experienced was no delusion. That much I'm sure of. I guess if I'm going to convince anyone this threat is real, I'll need to explain how I got to this point. Whether anyone believes me afterwards, I guess that's not up to me. All I can do is tell the truth as I understand it. Because before that last fateful trip to the Arctic, I was a respected climate scientist. I took part in numerous studies and surveys, helping to map and predict changing conditions at both poles. My work was largely praised for its thoroughness and data sets. When it came to research, I liked using both quality and quantity to get my points across. I've just never been the kind of guy who does anything halfway. If it sounds like I'm bragging, I promise it's not out of ego. I just need to establish that my name carried a lot of weight in this field. Now granted, my name has since been removed from a lot of past reports, but there was a time when my research on polar climate was considered the gold standard. That took me quite far in the scientific community, especially in a field as politically charged as climate science. I know there's a lot of non-scientific baggage that comes with researching climate. You don't just deal with other academics, you also have to deal with politicians, activists, and the fossil fuel lobby. Like it or not, there's a lot of money tied up in climate science, both directly and indirectly. Now, I always tried to remain politically neutral in that regard. Although I freely admit, I did grow quite frustrated with the zealots and crackpots who keep claiming global warming is a hoax. I have a feeling those people will be in for a hell of an awakening when they find out what's coming. But I didn't waste my time with those people for the most part. I was content just making regular trips to the Arctic, spending months on end at research stations in Antarctica, and just as much time at the North Pole. Many colleagues used to tell me that I had this aura to me when I was deep in my work. One grad student even said that I was uniquely attuned to the Arctic. If only she knew how observant she'd been that day. My connections to nature aside, my research progressed rapidly. In the early years, I produced many detailed models and projections on warming trends throughout the Arctic. I made important calculations on the rate at which polar ice was melting, as well as how that rate would likely change in the coming years. More often than not, my predictions were accurate, more so than most working in my field. Had I only stuck to that kind of research, I'd probably still be doing it. I might even be blissfully unaware of the horror that awaits us all. But if I'm being honest, I doubt that ever would have come to pass. I know myself too well. I know how I get when I see an anomaly in the data. This brings me to the other research I conducted. But it was considerably different from tracking temperatures and measuring melting ice. It involved dramatic shifts in the distant past, as opposed to the present. I actually stumbled across it by accident. During some trips to Antarctica, I studied some ice cores taken by a separate research team. Those cores went back hundreds of thousands of years, preserving critical atmospheric data from different eras of Earth's history. For a climate scientist, this was the data equivalent of the Library of Congress. But it was one particular era of those cores that caught my attention, and it occurred at a time roughly 75,000 years ago. Now, unless you're well versed in the study of anthropology, geology, and human evolution, you might not know why that period is so relevant. It was a time when the population was so reduced to such an extent that it showed in our genetic variation, or lack thereof. Some sources even claim that the human populations was so significantly culled that only around 10 to 30,000 individuals remained at one point. For context, you could comfortably fit that many people in most modern baseball stadiums. Now, that kind of event is not a trivial moment in the history of a species. Many rarely come back from an event like that, but humanity somehow succeeded. It's one of the many unsolved mysteries about the history of the human race. Look up the potential causes of this genetic bottleneck, and most will attribute it to a sudden shift in the climate, likely caused by the Toba supervolcano eruption in Sumatra. But the evidence for that or other causes is scant at best. And after going over all past and current data, I just kept noticing more and more inconsistencies. The world during that era clearly had undergone a major upheaval. In terms of climate and geologic timescales, it all happened so suddenly, like a freak tornado ripping through an otherwise peaceful landscape. Nothing I saw within these cores made sense. It didn't fit a supervolcano eruption, an asteroid impact, or some kind of solar anomaly. And the more I analyzed the data, the less sense it made. And for a data junkie like me, that just drew me in even more. I was convinced that there was more to the story, and none of our current theories fit the totality of the data. So, in an effort to learn more, I sought more ice core samples. Now, that is not as easy as it sounds. Drilling for ice core samples in the Arctic is an intensive process, requiring machines and personnel that don't come cheap. And I kinda had to lie to the university funding the expedition. I convinced them I needed the cores for my next climate model. That was not entirely inaccurate, but it was still a lie. It was also the only way I could get the data I sought. But, thanks again to my reputation, the university didn't ask too many questions. They authorized what was likely the most ambitious ice core drilling operation to date. I, along with a team of specialized personnel, ventured to a remote region of Antarctica, one that likely hadn't been disturbed for millennia. Early surveys claimed that there was a small lake underneath part of the ice sheet, but it was too small to warrant further study. In that sense, it seemed ideal for a quality ice core sample. And for the first couple days of work, everything went smoothly. A team of experienced drillers and contractors worked the equipment, and I stood by with some assistants to catalog every sample that came in. It was all going very well. But then, on the last day, something went wrong. Something went very, very wrong. The team started to drill for what was to be the last core sample. But then, the machine stalled. It started making these weird grinding noises that caught the team by surprise. The lead operator, this grizzled old roughneck who'd seen it all with respect to drilling, was not amused. He claimed they hit something that definitely was not ice or rock. Now that shouldn't have been possible. By my calculations, we were nowhere close to the lake under the ice sheet. The operator wanted to pull out. But, me being the obsessive science type, I urged him to try again. And that might go down in history as the most regrettable decision a scientist has ever made. Because when they tried to drill deeper, they hit it again. But this time, something hit back. And it hit hard. I swear, the whole camp shook violently. We could feel the ice under us cracking and rupturing. It sent everyone into a panic. My first instinct was to sound the alarm to evacuate the area. But then the operator tried to retrieve the drill. And in doing so, it dragged something up with it. And it was not ice. Now keep in mind, everything around me is still shaking. And most everyone is trying to get away, worried that we might fall into a chasm. But when I saw what came up through the ice, well, let's just say it momentarily shut off my instincts for self-preservation. It was a mass, for lack of a better word. Not an amorphous blob or some kind of mud. It was akin to the flesh of a whale or shark. Bulbous and fatty, but clearly guided by some form of instinct. The drill operator was closest to it, and like me, he was taken aback by shock. But unlike me, he was brave or foolish enough to reach out and touch it. And when he did, he recoiled in horror. Now remember, this man is a hardened explorer. There isn't much he hasn't seen in this kind of environment. So for him to react like that, it had to be something uniquely terrifying. He fell dead right in front of me in less than a minute. That was all the reason I needed to drop what I had and run. But before I could even turn around, another mass from the drill shot out at me. I managed to avoid most of it, but some of it grazed my exposed face, just long enough for me to make contact. And at that moment, I closed my eyes, and I saw something. Someone appear before me. I couldn't make it out, but I distinctly remember the eyes, this pair of big, ominous eyes staring at me. And as I looked back at them, I heard a voice.
Finally awake. Finally aware. Must reclaim.
That was all I heard before a coworker of mine came in and pulled me away. The drill operator was gone, but everyone else made it out. We then managed to radio for help and eventually make it back to the main research base. They all kept saying it was a simple ice fissure, the kind that happened all the time with intensive drilling. But I knew it was so much more. I also didn't dare speak up, not if I wanted to keep my reputation and my sanity. I swear, I didn't sleep for 3 days afterwards. Every time I tried, I just kept seeing those eyes and hearing that voice. It was so clear to me. This thing under the ice. It was big. It was alive. And when it sensed me, it was very, very upset. I tried to make sense of it. I tried to rationalize it, going so far as to get a brain scan. But I was painfully coherent. And in that brief moment I made contact with that thing, I felt its intentions. I knew it had been sleeping, or trapped possibly. And because the polar ice was melting, it was only a matter of time before it woke up. A part of me wanted to go back to conduct more tests, but the university refused, claiming that part of the ice sheet was no longer safe. Honestly, I'm glad they denied me. It probably would have been foolish to try that spot again. But I was still convinced of what I had experienced, and my gut told me there was more to this. So, out of desperation and maybe a little bit of ego, I requested another expedition, this time to the North Pole. Again, I didn't tell the university the entire truth. I just claimed I still needed samples, but from a more diverse set of ice cores. It still wasn't entirely wrong, and it was more than enough to get me the funding I needed. They even let me pick the site, which was critical, because I made sure to seek out an area with similar conditions to the one in Antarctica. That wasn't easy. Ice sheets may all look the same, but the topography of the North Pole and South Pole are very different. I wasn't even sure I could find such a site. But eventually I did. This remote area of the Greenland ice sheet, an area remote even to the local Inuit tribes, had the same type of subterranean structures. Earlier satellite scans hinted that there was some sort of ancient lake below. Like the other one from Antarctica, it seemed too small to be worthy of note, and I honestly went through hoping I would find nothing. It would have been so much easier if I had found nothing, but that's not what happened. It played out almost identical to my last expedition. I led a team to the site, and we set up a drilling camp. Then, we started taking ice cores. Now, I was a lot more attentive this time. Even though the team was very experienced, I insisted on helping them with the operations, bearing in mind that my knowledge of deep core drilling is somewhat limited. They thought I was just being a paranoid, uptight academic. And maybe I was for the first few days. But once again, our last day there changed all that. During the last round of drilling, we hit something again. But unlike before, I made the man stop the drill and hold it in place. I wasn't going to push it, and I wasn't going to provoke it, whatever it was. But despite being extra careful with the retrieval, it triggered another round of tremors. It wasn't as serious as last time, but it was still more than enough for the men to voice their concerns. Not wanting them to face the same horror I saw, I sounded the alarm and got them to evacuate the site. However, I managed to stay behind, and I stayed within that confined area with the drill, waiting to see if what I hit was similar to what I found in Antarctica. For a while, it was silent. Even the alarms in the distance felt muted. But then, something came up through the drill core, something that looked like the same mass of flesh as before. But this time, it didn't look so amorphous and disorganized. It looked like an arm. A human-like arm with dark, blubbery skin. And it was flailing about like a drowning man reaching up from the water, trying to latch onto something. Once again, I froze. Part of me was relieved and horrified. On one hand, I proved I wasn't crazy. What I saw before was real. But another part of me was also curious. More curious than horrified, even. I don't know what possessed me to reach out and grasp that thing, but when I did, I saw it again. Those monstrous eyes that filled me with such dread. And then I heard the voice again. But this time, it had a lot more to say. And what it told me, well, I'll just let the words speak for themselves.
Awake, alert, finally. But the humans, they live? This is an affront. Should have been wiped out. Should have been dealt with. Their presence, their impact on this world, our world, it's too much. must wake the others, must eliminate the humans. This is our planet. They will not take it. We must take it back.
Trust me, it's even more horrifying when you hear it said with such abject hatred. But in addition to the words, I got a better glimpse of what this thing was and what it planned to do. They don't go by a name or a label. So I called them the polar Leviathans. And what they are is akin to an apex predator, but a few levels above. These things, these massive living monstrosities, they've been lording over this planet for eons, far longer than any human or primate that has ever existed. They've watched life unfold. Near as I could tell, they don't guide or affect it very much, they just live with it. Through every era, every extinction event, every fork in evolution, the polar Leviathans have been there. But then humans came along. And 75,000 years ago, these creatures decided that humans were too dangerous. They had affected Earth's ecosystem too much for their liking. So they decided to purge them from this world. How they did that, how they chose to go about it, I can never hope to describe it. I'll just say it's far more terrifying than a supervolcano eruption. But, near as I can tell, the polar Leviathans strained themselves too much. They caused such a shift in the climate that they ended up trapping themselves under these massive ice sheets. I suspect they thought it was necessary, and that their efforts were sufficient to wipe out the human race. But I guess we were a lot more stubborn than they thought. Humanity, despite being severely cold, survived. We somehow managed to come back from that massive genetic bottleneck, eventually rising to become the dominant species on this planet. It was exactly what the polar Leviathans sought to prevent. And honestly, their concerns about us destroying the planet and ruining the ecosystem, can you honestly say they were wrong? It was that last realization that left me so shaken. Maybe that's why the creature ultimately let me go. It didn't do to me what the other one did to the drill operator. Maybe it just decided I wasn't worth killing at the moment. But whatever its reasons, I left that site with no intention of ever returning to the Arctic. I also left knowing that we were already past the point of no return. I know better than most how much the climate was changing. I also know that it won't be much longer before those massive ice sheets melt, finally allowing the polar Leviathans to awaken, rise, and finish what they started. I don't know when exactly it'll happen. I just know that the ice is melting faster with each passing day, and there's neither the mechanisms nor the political will to stop it. As I speak, we are a species living on borrowed time. We were never meant to achieve our current state in Earth's ecosystem. But by fluke, accident, or just dumb luck, we did. And now, that 75,000-year reprieve is almost up. Forget every other threat posed by climate change and rising sea levels. The polar Leviathans are coming. And when they fully awaken and see what we've done to this world, they're going to be angry. Very, very angry.